The old house groaned softly as the wind pressed against its weathered walls, the smell of aged wood and lavender lingering in the air. I'd come here for peace, a quiet retreat to finish my work, but the forest beyond the windows seemed alive in a way that unsettled me. The first night, I heard it a low, mournful howl that seemed to curl through the trees and into my bones. By the second, I started seeing movement at the edge of the woods, shadows that melted into the darkness before I could get a proper look. Then, on the third night, he appeared. I was gathering firewood when he stepped out of the tree line, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair wild from the wind. His eyes glowed faintly, catching the moonlight in a way that wasn't natural. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice deep and edged with something that felt like a warning. I straightened, clutching the bundle of wood tighter. "I am not going anywhere. This was my grandmother's home. That may be, but the forest doesn't belong to you," he said, stepping closer. "And it won't protect you unless you're willing to protect it in return." Before I could respond, the silence shattered with a guttural snarl, distant but closing in. His head whipped toward the sound and his expression darkened. "Go inside," he ordered, his voice sharp now. "Lock the doors." Dante opened them for anyone but me. I hesitated, but something in his tone left no room for argument. As I retreated toward the house, I caught a final glimpse of him, standing at the edge of the forest, his figure blurring as the shadows seemed to rise around him. Chapter 1, returning to the farmhouse, the tires of Natalie's old hatchback crunched over the icy driveway as she pulled up to the weathered farmhouse. The wooden structure stood stoic against the bitter Wisconsin winter, its red paint faded to a muted rust, and its shutters hanging at uneven angles. It was smaller than she remembered, more fragile somehow, like it was clinging to the land for support. Natalie stepped out into the biting wind, the cold snapping at her cheeks. She shoved her hands into her coat pockets, surveying the place that had once been her haven during childhood summers. Her grandmother's home had been filled with warmth, then the scent of baking pies wafting through open windows, the sound of her laugh as she spun stories of the woods that bordered the property. Now, it was eerily silent. The snow blanketed everything in a heavy stillness, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind threading through the bare trees. She hauled her suitcase from the car and trudged up the creaking steps to the front door. The key was exactly where her mother had said it would be, hidden beneath a loose floorboard on the porch. Sliding it into the lock, she felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't visited since her grandmother's funeral 2 years ago. Life in Chicago had consumed her deadlines, pitches, and the endless hustle of freelance writing. Coming here now felt like a retreat but also an intrusion. The door groaned open, and the musty smell of disuse greeted her. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The furniture was covered in dust and draped with old sheets. She set her bag down, rubbing her arms to ward off the chill. The kitchen was the same, albeit more worn. The faded linoleum tiles were cracked in places, and the curtains hung limply, their floral pattern barely discernible. She ran her fingers along the countertop, memories flooding back of her grandmother teaching her to make blackberry jam here, the way her hands had been steady despite her age. Natalie smiled faintly, but the warmth of the memory was fleeting. The house felt different now, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. By the time she unpacked and managed to start a fire in the old stone hearth, the sun was setting behind the line of trees. The snow outside glowed faintly in the twilight, casting a bluish hue over the yard. Natalie pulled a blanket around her shoulders and curled up on the couch. Her laptop rested on her knees, but the blinking cursor on the blank document mocked her. She had come here to write, to escape the clamor of the city and focus. Yet now that she was here, inspiration was as elusive as the sound of her grandmother's voice. A sharp knock on the door startled her, and she nearly dropped the laptop. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of nowhere? She hesitated, but the knock came again, firmer this time. Setting the laptop aside, she padded to the door, her heart racing. When she opened it, the man on the other side seemed as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Hi," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against a flannel jacket. His dark hair was damp from the falling snow, and a faint scar curved along his jawline. Didn't he know anyone was staying here? Natalie blinked, gripping the door tighter. Yeah, I am Natalie. My grandmother used to live here." The man nodded slowly, his piercing gray eyes studying her. "You must be Eleanor's granddaughter. I am Ezra. I live just down the road." Natalie relaxed a fraction, but didn't he let go of the door. "Nice to meet you, Ezra. Sorry if I startled you by showing up." I didn't he think there was anyone else out here? His lips quirked into a faint smile. "Not many of us left. Just thought I'd check in." Winter can be tough out here, especially if you're not used to it. Something about him was both reassuring and unsettling, as if he were a part of the woods themselves, wild and unyielding. "Thanks, but I think I'll be fine," Natalie said, her tone more confident than she felt. Ezra nodded but lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting to the woods behind her. "If you need anything, I am just down the road. Be careful at night." The forest can be unpredictable. Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching through the snow. That night, Natalie lay awake in the dark, her grandmother's quilt pulled tightly around her. The farmhouse creaked and groaned as the wind pressed against it, but her mind was on Ezra. His warning replayed in her head, vague and unsettling. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were restless. She saw shadows darting through the trees, heard howls that echoed in her bones. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, and then she heard it. A low, mournful howl that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. The haunting sound lingered in the air, rising and falling like a spectral cry carried by the night. Natalie sat frozen in bed, her breath shallow as she strained to hear more. It wasn't a dog of that much, she was certain. The sound was deeper, more resonant, as though it came from a throat too large and primal to belong to any ordinary animal. She slipped out of bed, wrapping her grandmother's quilt around her shoulders. The floor was icy beneath her bare feet as she crept to the window. Moonlight bathed the snow-covered yard in a pale glow, casting long shadows across the trees. The world looked quiet, serene even, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. And then she saw it. Near the edge of the woods, a figure stood silhouetted against the trees. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be, but there was something off about the way he held himself, something unnatural in the way his body seemed to tremble. Her breath hitched as he stepped into the light. Ezra. His dark hair was wild, and his shirt hung open, exposing bare skin beneath. He was barefoot, his feet planted firmly in the snow, yet he didn't seem to notice the cold. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Natalie reached for the latch on the window, intending to call out to him, but the sound of another howl stopped her. It was louder this time, closer, and it came from deep within the forest. Ezra's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Natalie's hand hovered over the window, unsure of what to do. She didn't know Ezra well, barely at all, in fact, but every instinct told her he was in danger. Before she could act, he turned toward the house, his gaze locking onto her window. His eyes weren't gray anymore. They glowed amber, like molten gold, burning with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. He raised a hand and motioned sharply for her to stay put, his lips forming a single word she couldn't hear but understood all the same. Inside. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped back from the window, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the very house was watching her. The howl came again, and this time it was answered by another, and another, until the air was alive with the mournful symphony of wolves. Natalie's thoughts raced. There weren't supposed to be wolves in this part of Wisconsin, at least not so close to people. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The farmhouse was too remote, surrounded by dense forest that blocked cell towers. A sudden knock at the door jolted her out of her panic. "Open up." Ezra's voice called, low but urgent. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the lock. Something in her gut screamed at her to be cautious. His voice sounded strained, almost guttural, as though he was holding something back. "Natalie," he said again, softer this time. "Please, open the door." Her heart wavered, and before she could think better of it, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Ezra stepped inside quickly, his presence overwhelming in the small entryway. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and his eyes still held that unnatural golden hue. He slammed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, his breathing ragged. "What's going on?" Natalie demanded, her voice trembling. "What were those sounds?" "You shouldn't have opened the door," he muttered, his tone laced with frustration. She bristled at his words, anger flickering through her fear. "Then maybe you shouldn't be standing out in the snow looking like what?" he asked sharply, stepping closer. She faltered, the words dying on her lips. His presence was magnetic, but not in the comforting way it had been earlier. Now it was raw, almost predatory, and her instincts screamed at her to keep her distance. "Like you don't belong to this world," she finally whispered. Ezra's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hand flexing as though he were resisting some invisible pull. "You need to stay inside. Lock the doors, close the curtains. Don't step outside no matter what you hear." "Ezra, you're not making any sense." "I don't have time to explain," he said, his voice rising slightly. "The woods aren't safe tonight. Something's out there, and if you don't listen to me, you're going to regret it." The weight of his words pressed down on her, leaving her torn between curiosity and fear. "What's in the woods? Is it wolves?" His eyes flicked back to her, and for a moment she saw something almost vulnerable behind their golden glow. Something worse. A shiver coursed through her as the howls outside grew louder, more frenzied. She thought she saw movement in the trees, shadows darting between the trunks. Ezra straightened, his body taut with tension. "I have to go." "Go where?" Natalie asked, panic rising in her chest. "To keep you safe," he said simply, his tone resolute. Before she could stop him, he yanked the door open and disappeared into the night, the cold air rushing in behind him. Natalie stood frozen in place, her mind racing. The house suddenly felt much larger, its shadows stretching into corners she couldn't see. She wanted to follow him, to demand answers, but fear held her back. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of a growl, low and guttural, just outside the window. Natalie's heart felt like it might burst as the growl reverberated through the walls. She turned toward the sound, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Her breath fogged the glass as she peered cautiously out the window. The yard appeared empty, still bathed in the faint glow of the moon. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw movement at the tree line. Shadows flickered between the trunks, quick and sinuous, accompanied by faint, unnatural sounds, the crunch of snow, the snap of branches, and soft panting that seemed too heavy to be from any ordinary animal. Suddenly, something burst from the trees, a blur of fur and muscle. It was massive, far larger than any wolf Natalie had ever imagined, its form both elegant and terrifying. The beast's thick black coat glistened in the moonlight, and its glowing eyes amber, like Ezra's, cut through the darkness with an eerie luminescence. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The wolf-like creature stopped at the edge of the yard, its head tilted toward the farmhouse as if it were listening. The air grew thick with an otherworldly tension, the kind that made every instinct in her body scream to run and hide. But Natalie couldn't move. A sharp howl shattered the silence, and the creature's head snapped toward the sound. A second figure darted into the clearing, smaller but just as terrifying. Its movements were sleek, predatory, and filled with a savage energy. The two creatures circled each other, growling low in their throats. Natalie watched in horrified fascination as they lunged at each other, their bodies colliding with a force that made the ground tremble. Snarls and growls tore through the night as they wrestled, their sharp teeth flashing and claws slashing at fur and flesh. Her hand shot to her phone, fumbling to record or call for help. but the screen displayed no service. She cursed under her breath, her fingers trembling as she pressed it uselessly against her chest. The larger wolf suddenly gained the upper hand, pinning its opponent to the ground with a ferocious snarl. It reared its head back, ready to strike, but then it hesitated. Natalie squinted, realizing with a start that the smaller creature's form was shifting. Its fur receded, muscles contorting and shrinking, until what lay beneath the massive beast was no longer an animal but a man. A man she recognized. Ezra. Natalie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He lay motionless in the snow, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The larger wolf growled, stepping back as if unsure what to do next. Its glowing eyes darted toward the farmhouse, and for one terrifying moment, Natalie thought it would come for her. But instead, it turned and bounded back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows. Natalie's legs felt like jelly as she leaned against the wall for support. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of disbelief and terror. What had she just witnessed? What was Ezra? Before she could stop herself, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and threw on her boots and coat. Fear twisted in her gut as she stepped outside, the cold air biting into her skin. Every rational part of her screamed to stay in the house, lock the doors, and wait for morning. But she couldn't leave him out there. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she crossed the yard, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her. She stopped a few feet from where Ezra lay, his body limp in the crimson-stained snow. "Ezra," she whispered, her voice shaking. His eyes fluttered open, their golden glow now dim and fading. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but his arms gave out beneath him. Didn't he come closer, he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Are you kidding?" She shot back, kneeling beside him despite his protest. "You're bleeding. I need to get you inside." He shook his head weakly, his face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have come out here." "Well, I did," she snapped, adrenaline and fear making her bolder than she felt. "Now shut up and let me help you." She slipped an arm under his shoulders, grunting as she tried to lift him. He was heavier than he looked, and his body radiated heat, as if a fever burned just beneath his skin. With a strained effort, she managed to half drag, half carry him back to the farmhouse. His breathing was shallow, and he muttered incoherently under his breath, his words broken and nonsensical. When they finally crossed the threshold, Natalie kicked the door shut behind them and eased him onto the couch. She grabbed a towel from the bathroom and pressed it against the wound on his side, her hands trembling as she applied pressure. What the hell is going on, Ezra?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What were those things? What are you?" He winced, his hand weakly clutching at hers. "You shouldn't have seen that." "Well, I did," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Now tell me the truth." His golden eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his gaze. "I told you to stay inside," he whispered, "because the woods are full of monsters. And tonight, so am I." Her breath caught, but she didn't let go of his hand. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." Ezra's eyes fluttered shut, his body going slack as exhaustion overtook him. Natalie sat frozen beside him, her mind spinning. The howls in the distance began again, faint but unmistakable. Natalie didn't move for a long time, her hand still pressed against Ezra's wound. His breathing had steadied, but his body remained unnaturally warm, radiating heat like an ember smoldering beneath the surface. The howls in the distance grew fainter, fading into the vast expanse of the forest. Yet the tension in the farmhouse lingered, the air heavy with questions and unspoken fears. She finally tore her gaze away from him, surveying the room with growing unease. The quilt she had dropped earlier was sprawled across the floor, and the flashlight she had brought in sat discarded on the counter. Every creak of the old house made her flinch, as if the shadows themselves were watching. Natalie stood, her knees wobbling, and fetched a basin of warm water from the kitchen. She didn't know what she was doing. She wasn't a doctor or a nurse, but she couldn't just leave him like this. She returned to the couch and carefully began cleaning the blood from his side. The wound was deep, a jagged gash that ran along his ribs, but it wasn't bleeding as much as she'd expected. The edges of the cut seemed strange, almost as if the flesh were knitting itself together. She leaned closer, her breath catching when she realized it was the wound was healing right before her eyes, the torn skin drawing together in a way that defied logic or science. "What are you?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra stirred slightly, his face tightening in pain, but he didn't answer. His body shifted, and she noticed the muscles in his arms twitching as though they were caught in some internal battle. She pulled the blanket up over him, her mind racing. Hours passed, the room illuminated only by the dim glow of the dying fire. Natalie sat curled in a chair across from the couch, watching Ezra as he slept. His face, now peaceful, seemed younger somehow, the sharp lines softened in the flickering light. She thought back to everything he had said, or rather, hadn't he said. The cryptic warnings. The way his eyes had glowed like molten gold. The way he had fought that creature in the snow with a ferocity that wasn't human. And then there was the transformation she had witnessed the rival wolf becoming a man. Her grandmother's stories came rushing back to her. Tales of the forest whispered late at night over cups of steaming tea. Stories about protectors of the woods, creatures that walked the line between man and beast. Natalie had always dismissed them as fanciful folklore, a product of her grandmother's vivid imagination. But now she wasn't so sure. The sound of Ezra shifting on the couch broke her reverie. He groaned softly, his hand moving to his side. His eyes opened slowly, and for a moment they locked on hers. "Water," he rasped, his voice hoarse. She jumped to her feet, grabbing the glass she had set aside earlier. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and she felt the warmth of his skin. He drank deeply, his throat working with each swallow. "Thanks," he muttered, setting the glass down with a shaky hand. He leaned back, wincing slightly. "Don't thank me yet," Natalie said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I still don't know what the hell is going on." Ezra sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I didn't want you to get involved." "Well, too late for that," she snapped, folding her arms across her chest. "I saw everything, Ezra. The fight, the change. And your eyes," she faltered, shaking her head. "You owe me an explanation." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, they were back to their normal gray, but they held a heaviness that made her stomach churn. "You wouldn't like the truth," he said quietly. "Try me," she challenged, her heart pounding. Ezra hesitated, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I am a werewolf, Natalie," he said, the words heavy with resignation. "I know how that sounds, but it's the truth." She stared at him, her mind spinning. Part of her wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as some elaborate joke. But the memory of his transformation, his glowing eyes, his battle with the other wolf was burned into her mind. "How?" she whispered. "How is that even possible?" "It's a curse," Ezra said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "One that's been in my family for generations. We rebound to the woods, to the land. And on nights like this, under the full moon, he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor." Natalie swallowed hard. "That thing you were fighting, was that another werewolf?" Ezra nodded grimly. "Not just any werewolf. One of the Shadow Pack. The Shadow Pack," she repeated, her brow furrowing. "They're a rival group," he explained, his tone growing darker. "They've been hunting me for years, trying to claim this territory. The woods are sacred, tied to old magic, and they'll do anything to take control of it." Natalie shivered, her mind racing with questions. "And me?" she asked hesitantly. "Why did you warn me to stay inside? Am I in danger?" Ezra's jaw tightened, and he met her gaze. "Yes," he said bluntly. "The Shadow Pack isn't just after me. They'll target anyone who gets in their way. That includes you." Her stomach sank. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was trying to protect you," Ezra said, his voice softening. "You don't belong in this fight, Natalie. You don't deserve to be dragged into my mess." She looked at him, her fear giving way to a flicker of anger. Well, it is too late for that, isn't it? I am already involved whether I want to be or not. Ezra didn't he respond, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Natalie took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. So, what do we do now? Ezra looked up at her, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. We survive, he said, and we fight back. Natalie's chest tightened at Ezra's words. Fight back. The idea sounded ludicrous, like something out of a fever dream she couldn't wake from. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why this was happening to her, why the safe refuge she sought in her grandmother's farmhouse had turned into a waking nightmare. But Ezra's expression, a mixture of weariness and steely resolve, held her back. How? She finally asked, her voice a whisper. How do we fight back against that? Ezra leaned back against the couch, his movements slow and measured as though every muscle ached. His gray eyes softened, a flicker of guilt passing through them. You don't, I do. You're not part of this, Natalie. I'll handle the shadow pack. All you need to do is stay here, stay safe. No, she said sharply, surprising even herself. I am not just going to sit around while those things are out there, she gestured toward him, her hands shaking. You can't even stand properly right now. What makes you think you can protect both of us? Ezra gave a faint, humorless chuckle. You've got more fire in you than I thought. This isn't funny, Natalie snapped. I want answers. Real answers. Why are they after you? Why are the woods so important? And what does any of this have to do with me? Ezra sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated, he began, but Natalie cut him off. Then simplify it, she said, her voice rising. I deserve to know. For a long moment he was silent, his jaw tight as if he were weighing how much to tell her. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. The land your grandmother's farmhouse sits on is special. Sacred. It's connected to ancient magic, the kind that's tied to the earth, to life itself. That magic binds everything here, the forest, the animals, the people. He paused, his gaze steady. And the wolves. Natalie frowned. What does that have to do with you? My family has been tied to this land for generations, Ezra said, his tone tinged with bitterness. We were its guardians, chosen to protect it from those who would abuse its power. But being a guardian comes with a price. The curse, Natalie guessed, her stomach nodding. Ezra nodded. The curse. He hesitated before continuing. The Shadow Pack was once part of the Guardians long ago, but they broke away, corrupted by their greed for more power. They believe that by controlling the forest, they can claim the magic for themselves. And to do that, they need to eliminate anyone standing in their way, including me. Natalie absorbed his words, her mind spinning. And my grandmother, was she involved in this? Ezra's expression softened. Your grandmother was one of the strongest allies my family had. She didn't have magic herself, but she understood the land, the old ways. She helped keep the balance, especially after my parents were trailed off, his jaw tightening. Natalie's heart sank. They were killed, weren't they? He nodded. By the Shadow Pack. That's when the curse passed to me. Her breath hitched. The weight of his story pressed down on her, the threads of her grandmother's life weaving into a tapestry far more intricate and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But why are they after me? She asked. Ezra hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Because of your connection to this place. Your grandmother may be gone, but her bloodline carries her legacy. And he stopped, meeting her eyes. You retied to this land in ways you don't even realize yet. The Shadow Pack will see you as a threat. They'll try to use you, or worse. Natalie's pulse quickened. Use me? For what? Ezra's expression darkened. To control the magic. To break what remains of the balance. If they can turn you against me, or worse, force you to join them, he didn't finish, but the implication was clear. A chill ran down her spine. So, what do we do? Ezra's gaze hardened. We make sure they don't get the chance. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Ezra's strength gradually returned, though he remained pale and wary. Natalie spent the hours pacing the small farmhouse, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer, every creak of the old wood more ominous. By dawn, the tension had settled into a grim determination. "I need to go into the woods," Ezra said, breaking the silence as the first light of day filtered through the curtains. Natalie turned to him sharply. "Are you insane? You just said those things are out there waiting to kill you." "They 1T attack during the day," he replied. "Not outright, anyway. The forest is quieter and the daylight safer in some ways, but I can sit here doing nothing. I need to find out how close they are, what their next move might be." "I am coming with you," Natalie said before she could think better of it. Ezra frowned. "No, it's too dangerous." "And it's dangerous for you to go alone," she countered, her voice firm. "You said yourself that I am already involved. If they after me too, I might as well learn how to deal with them." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but you do exactly what I say. No questions, no hesitation. Understand?" Natalie nodded, ignoring the knot of fear tightening in her chest. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing but no less alive. The trees loomed tall and silent, their bare branches stark against the pale winter sky. The snow crunched underfoot as Natalie followed Ezra through the woods, her breath visible in the cold air. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. She kept pace with him, her senses on high alert. Every sound, a rustling branch, the distant caw of a crow made her heart race. "What are we looking for?" she whispered. "Signs of them," Ezra replied. "Tracks, scents, anything that tells us how close they've gotten." They walked in silence for a while, the stillness of the forest broken only by their footsteps. Then Ezra stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Natalie froze, her eyes darting around. "What is it?" Ezra knelt, brushing the snow aside to reveal a set of tracks, paw prints larger than any she'd ever seen. "They've been here," he said grimly, his jaw tightening. Natalie stared at the tracks, her heart pounding. "How close are they?" Ezra didn't answer immediately. He straightened, his gaze scanning the trees. "Too close," he murmured, his tone ominous. "We need to go back. Now." Before she could respond, a low growl rumbled through the woods and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The growl wasn't far off. It rolled through the woods, deep and guttural, vibrating in Natalie's chest like a drumbeat. Her breath caught as she instinctively stepped closer to Ezra. His body tensed, his sharp eyes scanning the trees, his posture low and defensive like a predator ready to strike. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is it?" she asked, her own voice trembling. Ezra didn't answer immediately. He crouched slightly, his nostrils flaring as if he were scenting the air. When he turned back to her, his expression was grim. "One of them. Just one for now. But if they're S1, the others 1TB far behind." Natalie's heart pounded. She strained her ears, and another sound joined the growl, a rustling in the underbrush, deliberate and slow. Whatever was out there wasn't he trying to hide. Ezra grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "We're leaving." Now. They began moving back the way they had come, their steps quick but careful. Natalie's chest tightened with each sound behind them. The rustling grew louder, the growl more insistent. She risked a glance over her shoulder but saw only the shadowy trees, the bare branches clawing at the pale sky. "Don't look back," Ezra said, his voice low and urgent. "It's trying to bait you." Her pulse raced, and she forced herself to focus on his back as he led her through the forest. "Bait me," she whispered. "They want you afraid," he said. "Fear makes you reckless, vulnerable." She wanted to argue that she was already terrified, but there was no time. A sharp crack behind them made her gasp, and before she could stop herself, she turned. For a split second, she saw it. The creature stepped out from the shadows, its hulking form blending with the winter-draped forest. Its fur was a deep, silvery gray, bristling like a storm cloud. Its eyes glowed red, burning with malice. The thing moved with an unnatural grace, its head lowering as it locked its gaze on her. Natalie's blood turned to ice. Ezra cursed under his breath. "Run." He didn't wait for her to respond. He grabbed her wrist and took off, pulling her through the snow-covered woods at a breakneck pace. The trees blurred around them, their bare branches whipping past her face as she struggled to keep up. Behind them, the creature let out a furious snarl. Heavy footfalls crashed through the snow, and Natalie could hear it gaining on them. "Ezra," she cried, panic clawing at her throat. "I know," he shouted back. They burst into a small clearing, the farmhouse barely visible in the distance. Ezra stopped suddenly, spinning to face the way they'd come. "Keep going," he commanded, pushing her toward the house. "What? No," she protested. "I am not leaving you go, Natalie," he roared, his voice raw with urgency. "Get inside and lock the doors." Before she could argue further, the creature lunged into the clearing. It was even larger up close, its muscular frame rippling with barely contained power. Its eyes locked on Natalie, and its lips curled back to reveal long, jagged teeth. Ezra stepped between them, his body taut with tension. "Come on," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You want to fight? Let us see what you've got." To Natalie's horror, Ezra began to change. His body contorted, the cracking of bones filling the air as his muscles shifted beneath his skin. His hands grew into massive claws, and dark fur erupted along his arms. When he turned his head, his face was no longer fully human, his jaw had elongated, his teeth sharp and wolf-like. His eyes burned with golden fire, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely recognizable. "Run!" Natalie didn't need to be told again. She turned and sprinted toward the farmhouse, her legs burning with the effort. Behind her, the clearing erupted into chaos. She heard the clash of bodies, snarls and growls echoing through the trees. She didn't dare look back. The farmhouse loomed ahead, and she threw herself onto the porch, fumbling with the door. Her hands shook so violently that it took her 3 tries to unlock it. Finally, the door swung open, and she stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her ears straining for any sound. The fight outside raged on, the snarls and growls blending into an unholy cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Natalie froze, her breath caught in her throat. The silence was deafening, heavier than the darkest night. She pressed her ear to the door, her fingers clutching the wood. "Ezra," she whispered, barely daring to hope. A low creak came from the porch, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Her heart thudded painfully as she stepped back, her gaze locked on the door. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all was still. Then came a knock, soft, deliberate. "Natalie." It was Ezra's voice, but something about it was off. It was rougher, quieter, almost guttural. "Let me in," he said, his tone almost pleading. Her hand hovered over the latch, doubt creeping in. "Ezra, is it really you?" "Of course it's me," he replied. "The creature's gone. You're safe now. Open the door." Her instincts screamed at her to stay put, but her heart ached at the thought of leaving him out there. "Prove it," she said, her voice trembling. There was a long pause, and then his voice came again, softer this time. "Natalie, please." She hesitated, every muscle in her body tense. The doorknob rattled slightly, and her breath caught, and then she heard it. A low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, coming from just beyond the door. Natalie's entire body froze. The growl sent a ripple of icy terror down her spine, rooting her in place as the doorknob rattled again, harder this time. She backed away slowly, her gaze locked on the door as if it might burst open at any second. "Natalie, open the door." Ezra's voice came again, louder now, tinged with desperation. But beneath the surface, there was something else, something primal and wrong. Her instincts screamed louder than her fear. "It's not him. Ezra, wouldn't he growl at me?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her mind raced, trying to remember what she'd heard in the stories her grandmother used to tell. How could she be sure it wasn't him? How could she know for certain? "Natalie!" The voice outside was angrier now, harsher. The pounding on the door started, each thud rattling the wood and echoing through the house. "Show me your eyes," she shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. "If it's really you, show me your eyes." The pounding stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, suffocating in its weight. Then came a low chuckle, guttural and mocking. "Clever girl," the voice said, but it was no longer Ezra's. It was something darker, something that seemed to scrape against her very soul. Natalie stumbled backward, her hands fumbling for the nearest weapon. She grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, clutching it tightly in both hands. "You think you're safe in there?" The voice growled, a sinister edge to its tone. "You're not. None of you are." The door shuddered violently as though struck by a tremendous force. Natalie let out a sharp cry, gripping the poker tighter. The wood splintered slightly, cracks forming near the edges, but it held. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking. The growling outside deepened, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against the door. Natalie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might explode. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the assault stopped. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unnerving. Natalie remained frozen, the fire poker still clutched in her trembling hands. Her ears strained to pick up any sound, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Did it leave? She wondered, barely daring to hope. The thought was interrupted by a muffled noise, a groan, soft and familiar. Natalie, her breath hitched. It was Ezra's voice again, weak and ragged, coming from just beyond the door. "Please," he said, his tone pained. "It's really me. I am hurt." Tears stung her eyes as doubt clawed at her. Was it him this time? Could she risk it? "Ezra, if it's you, tell me something only you would know," she said, her voice trembling. There was a pause, and then "Your grandmother used to sing to you on the porch in the summer." Moon River. She said it was her favorite because it reminded her of your grandfather. Natalie's heart ached. It was true, something only Ezra could know. She rushed to the door, her hand hovering over the latch. But then, like a thunderclap, another memory struck her. Her grandmother had never sung Moon River on the porch. It had been somewhere over the rainbow. She froze, her blood running cold. "You're not him," she whispered. The voice outside faltered, and then a low growl rumbled through the door. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," it snarled. "But that one tea save you for long." Natalie stepped back just as the door shook violently again, the wood groaning under the force. Her hands tightened around the fire poker, her heart racing. A howl erupted outside, bone-chilling and furious, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. Natalie stood frozen, her ears ringing in the sudden silence. Minutes passed before she dared to move. She crept to the window and peered out cautiously. The clearing was empty, the snow undisturbed except for a set of deep tracks leading back toward the forest. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the fire poker falling from her hands with a metallic clang. Her breath came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face as the adrenaline drained from her body. She didn't know how long she sat there, trembling on the floor, before a soft knock at the door startled her again. "Natalie," came a familiar voice, weak but genuine. "It's me," her breath caught. This time she wasn't sure if she had the strength to answer. "It's Ezra," the voice said again, softer now. "I am hurt. Please let me in." She crawled to the door, her hands trembling as she pressed her ear against the wood. "Prove it," she whispered hoarsely. There was a long pause, and then, "I told you to stay inside. Because the woods are full of monsters." Her breath hitched. It was exactly what he'd said before he left. Slowly, cautiously, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. Ezra stood there, his body battered and bruised, his clothes torn and bloodied. His gray eyes met hers, weary but unmistakably human. "Thank God," she whispered, pulling the door open and helping him inside. As she locked the door behind him, she caught sight of the forest one last time. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, darker, as though the forest itself were watching. And somewhere in the distance, a faint howl echoed through the cold night. Natalie helped Ezra to the couch, her body trembling as she supported his weight. He leaned heavily on her, his breath shallow and uneven, but his steps were steady enough to give her hope that he wasn't as injured as he looked. Once he was seated, she quickly locked the door again, securing the bolt and checking the windows to make sure they were latched. Her mind spun, every shadow outside suddenly alive with menace. When she returned to him, Ezra was slumped against the back of the couch, his head tilted back, eyes closed. Blood streaked his arms and side, fresh and stark against the pale skin visible through the tears in his shirt. "Ezra," she said, her voice shaking. He opened his eyes, and she felt a wave of relief at the sight of their familiar gray hue. He offered her a weak smile, but the effort seemed to cost him. "I am okay," he rasped. "Just need a minute." Natalie wasn't convinced. "You re-bleeding," she said, already grabbing the towel she used earlier. "Let me see." He protest as she knelt beside him, her hands moving quickly but carefully as she assessed the damage. The cuts were deep, but already showing signs of closing. The edges raw but faintly pulling together in that unsettling, supernatural way she'd seen before. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not as much as it looks," he said, his tone dry despite the situation. "Perks of being cursed, I guess." She glared at him, her fear and frustration bubbling to the surface. "You joking about this now?" His smile faded and he looked away. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have to deal with any of this." Natalie paused, her hands stilling on the towel. "Ezra, stop saying that. I am already dealing with it. I need to know what's really going on so I can survive this." He sighed, his gaze meeting hers. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said firmly. "What are they? What do they want? Why did one of them come here pretending to be you?" Ezra's expression darkened, and for a moment he seemed older, weighed down by the gravity of his past. "They not just werewolves," he began. "The shadow pack isn't like me. They've given themselves over to the magic of the forest completely, corrupted by it. They stronger faster, but they've lost what makes them human. Their minds are fractured, twisted. They predators through and through. And the one tonight," Natalie pressed. Ezra hesitated. "It was one of their alphas, a powerful one. They can mimic voices, memories, tricks to lure their prey. It was trying to get to you." Her stomach churned. "Why me? What do they want with me?" Ezra leaned forward, wincing slightly. "Because of your grandmother. Because of you," she frowned, her chest tightening. "What does that mean?" "Your grandmother wasn't just a bystander in all of this," he explained. "She was a keeper of the land's secrets, one of the last people who understood how to protect the balance. When she passed, that legacy passed to you whether you realize it or not. The Shadow Pack knows that. If they can use you bend your will to theirs, they can break the last barrier protecting this place." Natalie shook her head, disbelief warring with the fear clawing at her throat. "I don't know anything about protecting the land. I don't even know what you're talking about." Ezra reached out, his hand resting on hers. "You will," he said softly. "You have to. This place it's more than just woods and snow. It's alive, Natalie. And it's tied to you in ways even I don't fully understand. That's why you have to be careful. The Shadow Pack won't stop until they have you." Her pulse quickened. "What can I do? How do I stop them?" Ezra's eyes were heavy with regret. "You can not alone. The Shadow Pack is relentless and you just one person, but there's a chance, a slim one, that we can end this, together." Natalie's breath caught. "How?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's an old ritual, buried in the magic of this place. It's dangerous, deadly even, but if we succeed, it could sever the Shadow Pack's connection to the land. It would weaken them, force them to leave." Her heart pounded. "And what happens to you?" Ezra's gaze flickered, but he didn't look away. "I don't know," he admitted. "The curse binds me to the land, too. If we break it, I might not survive." The weight of his words hung between them like a heavy fog. Natalie felt her chest tighten, her mind spinning with the enormity of what he was saying. "You asking me to risk your life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am asking you to protect yours," he replied. "And this place. If we don't do this, they'll take everything. The forest, the land, you." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. "What do we need for the ritual?" Ezra hesitated, clearly surprised by her determination. "Your grandmother's locket," he said finally. "It's the key to starting the ritual. Do you have it?" Natalie's brow furrowed. I didn't think so. I've looked through her things, but I haven't seen it." "Then we need to find it," Ezra said, his tone resolute. "It's here somewhere. And we didn't have much time. The Shadow Pack knows I am hurt. They'll come back, and next time they want to just send one of their alphas. Natalie swallowed hard, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Then we find the locket, she said firmly. Ezra nodded, his expression grim. And then we end this. The urgency in Ezra's words ignited something in Natalie, a sense of purpose that overpowered her fear, if only for a moment. She stood, her legs still shaky but resolute, and nodded toward the staircase leading to the farmhouse's upper floor. Her bedroom, she said. If it's anywhere, it'll be in there. Ezra pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and deliberate. He swayed slightly, and Natalie instinctively reached out to steady him. You need to rest, she said firmly. You're still hurt. There's no time, he countered, his voice steady despite his weakened state. If the locket is the key, we have to find it now. She wanted to argue but knew he was right. The shadow pack was out there, and every moment they wasted could bring them closer. Still, Ezra looked like he was barely holding himself together. Fine, she said. But don't push yourself too hard. He gave her a faint, humorless smile. I'll be fine. I've had worse. Together they ascended the creaking stairs, the farmhouse seeming to hold its breath around them. Natalie led the way to her grandmother's bedroom, the door sticking slightly as she pushed it open. The room was just as she remembered it, tidy, with the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the air. The quilted bedspread was neatly tucked, and the antique dresser stood against the far wall, its mirror slightly fogged with age. The place felt frozen in time, untouched since her grandmother's passing. Where would she have kept something like this? Ezra asked, his voice low as he scanned the room. Natalie walked to the dresser, her fingers brushing over the small trinkets and framed photos that lined its surface. Her grandmother had been sentimental, keeping everything from birthday cards to polished stones she found in the garden. She had a jewelry box, Natalie said, opening the top drawer of the dresser. Inside, neatly folded handkerchiefs and scarves greeted her. She rifled through them quickly but found nothing. Ezra moved to the nightstand, pulling open its single drawer. He sifted through its contents carefully: a Bible, a pair of reading glasses, a half-burned candle, but came up empty-handed. Could it be in storage? He asked, glancing at her. Natalie frowned, shaking her head. She wasn't the type to keep important things out of reach. If the locket was as significant as you say, she would have kept it close. They searched the room in tense silence, checking under the bed, behind the dresser, even in the old wooden wardrobe. Frustration built with each passing moment. Natalie was about to suggest checking another room when a flicker of memory stopped her. Her grandmother had always been protective of one particular item, a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. As a child, Natalie had asked about it countless times, but her grandmother had always said the same thing: that's not for curious hands, my dear. Someday, you'll understand. Her breath quickened as she dropped to her knees in front of the chest. The wood was worn but sturdy, the brass lock tarnished with age. She tried the latch, but it was locked tight. Here, Ezra said, kneeling beside her. He pulled a small folding knife from his pocket and began working at the lock. His hands moved deftly, his focus unwavering despite his injuries. With a soft click, the lock gave way, and the chest creaked open. Inside, Natalie found a collection of carefully arranged items: old photographs, handwritten letters, a pressed flower encased in glass. She sifted through them with trembling hands, her breath catching when her fingers brushed against something cool and metallic. She pulled it out slowly, a delicate silver locket on a chain. It was heavier than it looked, the surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. This is it, Ezra said, his voice reverent. The key. Natalie turned the locket over in her hands. How does it work? Ezra's expression darkened. The locket is more than just a key. It's a focus for the magic tied to this land. But activating it requires a blood offering. Her stomach churned. What kind of offering? Ezra hesitated, his gaze flicking to her. It has to be from the land's protector or the one who holds their legacy. That's you, Natalie. Her hands tightened around the locket. You mean I have to cut myself or something? He nodded solemnly. The ritual demands a sacrifice. It doesn't have to be fatal, but it has to be willingly given. Your blood will awaken the locket, allowing us to tap into the magic needed to break the Shadow Pack's hold. Natalie swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. And after that, Ezra's jaw tightened. After that, we have to confront them. The locket will weaken their connection to the land, but it won't stop them entirely. That's where the fight begins. Her fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, focusing on the weight of the locket in her palm. When do we do this? Tonight, he said. Before the next moonrise. They'll come for you then, and we need to be ready. Natalie nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we don't waste any more time. The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. Ezra walked her through the ritual's steps, his voice calm but firm as he explained the intricacies of the magic they were about to invoke. They gathered supplies from the farmhouse candles, salt, and an old iron blade from the kitchen that Ezra said would be crucial. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a deepening shadow, Natalie felt the weight of what lay ahead settle over her. She stood at the edge of the forest, the locket clutched tightly in her hand, as Ezra drew a protective circle in the snow with the iron blade. "Are you ready?" he asked, his gaze steady. "No," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But I'll do it anyway." Ezra gave her a faint smile. "That's all that matters." The first howl cut through the night, distant but unmistakable. "They recoming," Ezra said, his voice low. "Stay inside the circle. No matter what." Natalie nodded, her heart pounding as the shadows between the trees began to move. The forest seemed to come alive as the howls multiplied, echoing through the trees like a chorus of nightmares. Shadows darted at the edges of the clearing, moving too fast to be fully seen. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made Natalie's skin crawl. Ezra finished carving the protective circle in the snow, the iron blade leaving a faint glow in its wake. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the darkened tree line. His stance was rigid, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. "Stay inside the circle," he reminded her, his voice firm but quiet. Natalie clutched the locket tightly in one hand, the other gripping the iron blade he handed her earlier. "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll keep them back as long as I can," Ezra replied, his gaze not leaving the forest. "You focus on the ritual. The circle will hold, but it needs the magic from the locket to stay strong." Natalie swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. What if it doesn't work? He glanced at her, his gray eyes softening for a moment. "It'll work," he said simply. "It has to." Another howl split the night, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footfalls crunching through the snow. Natalie's breath caught as three figures emerged from the shadows, their forms massive and primal. The wolves were unlike anything she'd ever seen. They moved with an unnerving grace, their fur dark as the void and their eyes glowing a vivid crimson. The largest of the three stepped forward, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth as it let out a low, menacing growl. Ezra stepped in front of Natalie, his body blocking her from the approaching wolves. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice carrying an edge of authority that sent a shiver through her. The largest wolf snarled, its form beginning to shift. Bones cracked and reshaped, muscles rippling as it rose onto two legs. Within moments, the beast was no longer fully wolf but something grotesquely human, standing nearly 7 feet tall. Its glowing eyes locked onto Ezra. "Neither do you," it growled, its voice a guttural rasp. "Your time is over, Guardian. The land belongs to us now." "Not while I am still breathing," Ezra shot back, his voice a low snarl. The creature laughed, a dark, mocking sound. "Then we'll fix that." With a feral roar, the wolf leapt at Ezra, and the clearing erupted into chaos. Ezra met the attack head-on, his own transformation taking hold in a blur of motion. His body twisted and grew, fur sprouting along his arms and chest as his features contorted into something both human and wolf. The two collided with bone-jarring force, snarls and growls filling the air. Natalie stumbled backward, her foot brushing the edge of the protective circle. She looked down, her chest tightening as she realized the faint glow was already beginning to dim. The locket. Her hands shook as she unclasped the delicate chain and held the locket out in front of her. She remembered Ezra's instructions, the ritual words he repeated to her earlier. They came to her lips now, halting but determined. "By blood and bond, I call the ancient power of this land," she whispered, her voice quaking. "Awaken and protect us from the darkness." The locket grew warm in her hands, the intricate designs on its surface beginning to glow faintly. She glanced at the blade in her other hand, her stomach churning at what she had to do next. Another wolf charged into the clearing, its form sleek and deadly, but Ezra intercepted it with a ferocious snarl. The two tumbled into the snow, clawing and biting at each other as the third wolf circled the edge of the clearing, its red eyes locked on Natalie. Her breath caught. She couldn't wait any longer. Clenching her teeth, she pressed the blade's edge against her palm and drew it across the skin. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, as blood welled up and dripped onto the snow. The locket flared to life, its glow intensifying until it bathed the entire circle in a warm, golden light. The energy in the air shifted, and the oppressive weight that had surrounded her began to lift. The circling wolf snarled, recoiling as if struck. It darted back into the shadows, its crimson eyes glaring at her from a distance. "Keep going," Ezra shouted, his voice ragged as he grappled with the second wolf. "Dante, stop." Natalie's hands trembled as she raised the locket again, blood dripping from her palm onto the snow. She repeated the incantation, her voice growing steadier with each word. The circle's glow brightened, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The largest wolf, the one Ezra had first confronted, let out a furious howl. It broke away from him, its burning eyes fixed on Natalie. Enough! It roared, charging toward her. Her heart seized, and for a moment she froze. But then Ezra was there, slamming into the beast with a force that sent both of them crashing to the ground. "You're not touching her." Ezra snarled, his voice raw with fury. The locket's glow began to pulse, a rhythmic thrum that matched the pounding of Natalie's heart. The snow within the circle melted away, revealing the earth beneath, and the ground seemed to hum with power. The wolves hesitated, their movements faltering as the magic took hold. The air around the circle shimmered, the glow expanding outward in a wave of energy that sent the two remaining wolves staggering back. Ezra, locked in combat with the largest wolf, glanced toward Natalie. "Now, Natalie," he shouted. "Finish it." Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the locket tightly. The final words of the ritual spilled from her lips, her voice breaking but resolute. "By the will of the forest, by the blood of its protector, be bound or be banished." The locket exploded with light, a blinding radiance that engulfed the clearing. The wolves let out pained howls as the magic surged through them, their forms convulsing and twisting. The largest wolf threw Ezra off, its body writhing as the light consumed it. Its crimson eyes met Natalie's one last time, filled with rage and fear, before it disintegrated into ash. The remaining wolves fled into the forest, their howls fading into the distance. The clearing fell silent. Natalie collapsed to her knees, the locket falling from her hands. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her vision swimming. Ezra staggered toward her, his body still partially shifted. Blood streaked his fur, but his eyes were steady as he knelt beside her. "You did it," he said softly, his voice rough but full of awe. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Are they gone?" "For now," Ezra said, "but they'll think twice before coming back." Natalie nodded weakly, exhaustion overtaking her. Ezra caught her as she slumped forward, his arms wrapping around her protectively. The locket, now dim and cool, rested between them as the forest fell into a deep, uneasy calm. The quiet in the clearing was almost oppressive, broken only by Natalie's ragged breathing and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. She clung to Ezra as he held her, the warmth of his arms a fragile anchor in a world that had just turned itself upside down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The light from the locket had dimmed completely, and the snow-covered clearing looked almost normal again save for the scorch marks and clawed earth left behind by the fight. "Is it over?" Natalie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra didn't answer immediately. His gray eyes scanned the forest, his sharp senses on high alert. He sniffed the air, his head tilting slightly, and then he nodded. "For now," he said. "The Shadow Pack won't risk another attack tonight. The magic of the locket and what you did will keep them at bay for a while." Natalie sagged in relief, her body trembling as the adrenaline drained from her system. "I can believe I did that," she murmured, staring down at the locket still cradled in her hands. Ezra brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone who had been fighting for his life moments earlier. "You were incredible," he said softly. "Braver than anyone I've ever known." She met his gaze, her chest tightening at the raw honesty in his expression. But the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, and she looked away. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I still am. What if they come back? What if I can stop them next time?" "You will," Ezra said, his voice firm, "because you stronger than you think. You didn't just survive tonight, Natalie, you fought back. That's more than most people would be done." She let his words sink in, unsure if she believed them but grateful for the comfort they offered. Ezra helped her to her feet, his own movements stiff and labored. He was still partially shifted, the remnants of his wolf form clinging to him in small ways, clawed hands, elongated canines, but his eyes were fully human again. He winced as he took a step, his injuries clearly taking their toll. "You hurt," Natalie said, concern flooding her voice. "I'll heal," he replied, brushing it off. "The land's magic, it works on me too. I just need time." Natalie frowned, glancing at the blood staining his shirt and fur. "Time doesn't seem like a luxury we have." Ezra gave her a faint smile. "We bought ourselves a little of it tonight. That's enough for now." They began the slow walk back to the farmhouse, their steps crunching through the snow. Natalie kept the locket clutched tightly in her hand, its weight a constant reminder of what had just transpired. The walk felt endless, the shadows of the trees stretching long and ominous under the faint light of the moon. Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, lurking just out of sight. "They not here," Ezra said, as if reading her thoughts. "The pack is retreating. They'll regroup, but they won't risk another fight so soon." "How do you know?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ezra's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because they cowards. They fight when they think they can win. Tonight we proved them wrong." Natalie nodded, though her unease lingered. When they finally reached the farmhouse, Natalie felt a wave of relief wash over her. The sight of the familiar structure, weathered and worn but still standing strong, grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. Inside, she helped Ezra to the couch, where he sank down with a groan. She hurried to the kitchen to fetch warm water and clean cloths, her mind spinning as she tried to process everything. As she tended to his wounds, the silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ezra winced as she pressed a damp cloth to his side. "We wait," he said. "The pack will lick their wounds, but they'll be back eventually." They won't give up that easily. Natalie's stomach twisted. "And when they come back, we'll be ready," Ezra said, his tone resolute. "You've already taken the first step, Natalie. The locket is awakened now. It's a weapon as much as it is a shield. With it, we have a chance to fight back." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "But this isn't over, is it?" "No," Ezra admitted, his gaze steady. "This is just the beginning." Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Natalie sat by the fire, the locket resting in her hands. She turned it over and over, tracing the intricate designs with her fingers. Ezra had fallen asleep on the couch, his breathing deep and even. The tension in his face had eased, making him look almost peaceful. She envied his ability to rest, her own mind too restless to allow for sleep. The events of the night played over and over in her head: the fight, the ritual, the magic she had somehow summoned. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, a world full of danger and secrets that had been hidden from her for so long. But she wasn't the same person she had been when she arrived at the farmhouse. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of something stronger than fear, a spark of determination. She didn't know how she was going to face the battles ahead, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't run. The locket pulsed faintly in her hands, as if responding to her resolve. The forest outside remained quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows across the snow. Natalie took a deep breath and closed her fingers around the locket. Whatever was coming, she would be ready. The dawn brought an eerie calm to the farmhouse, but it did little to ease Natalie's nerves. She had spent the remainder of the morning cleaning the remnants of the fight from the porch and patching up Ezra's wounds as best she could. He stirred occasionally, his body visibly working overtime to heal itself. The locket remained warm against her chest, its faint hum a constant reminder of its power and the responsibility she now carried. As she moved through the farmhouse, she felt a new awareness of the land around her, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for her next move. Ezra woke just past noon, his movements slow but purposeful as he pushed himself upright. Natalie was sitting at the kitchen table, the locket laid out in front of her alongside her grandmother's journal, which she had discovered tucked away in the cedar chest. "You re-up," she said, her voice soft but tinged with relief. "Barely," he replied, his voice gravelly, "but IV had worse." She gestured to the journal. "I found this in the chest. I think it might help us figure out what to do next." Ezra moved to sit across from her, his gaze falling on the worn, leather-bound book. He reached out hesitantly, as though touching it might disturb something sacred. "Your grandmother was always one step ahead of everyone," he said. "If she left this behind, it's because she wanted you to have it." Natalie opened the journal, carefully turning the fragile pages. Her grandmother's handwriting was neat but dense, her notes filled with sketches of symbols, maps of the forest, and detailed observations of the land's behavior. "She knew about the shadow pack," Natalie murmured, her finger tracing an entry dated decades earlier. "She wrote about them here. A fracture in the guardianship threatens the balance. The wolves' greed grows unchecked, and their pack expands in defiance of the natural order." Ezra's expression darkened. "That sounds about right." Natalie flipped through more pages, stopping when she found a passage underlined in bold strokes. "The locket is the key to restoring harmony, but it cannot act alone. The bearer must forge a bond with the land itself, a connection unshakable and pure." "What does that mean?" she asked, looking up at Ezra. He leaned back, his brow furrowed in thought. "The locket channels the land's magic, but it's not enough on its own. You need to become a part of it, Natalie. A protector, like your grandmother was." Her stomach twisted. "How do I do that?" Ezra hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's not easy. It requires a ceremony, a binding ritual between you and the land. It'll give you the strength to wield the locket's power fully, but it comes at a cost." Natalie's throat tightened. "What kind of cost?" He looked away, his expression heavy with regret. "The bond is permanent. Once it's made, you'll never truly leave this place. Your life will be tied to the land, to its survival. And if something happens to it, I die," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra met her gaze, his eyes filled with both apology and admiration. Yes, the weight of his words pressed down on her, but as she stared at the locket, the faint spark of determination she had felt earlier began to grow. She thought of her grandmother, of the love and care she had poured into this land. She thought of Ezra, his body battered but unyielding, willing to fight to protect her and the forest. And she thought of the shadow pack, the malevolent force that had tried to claim her as its own. "I'll do it," Natalie said, her voice steady. Ezra blinked, surprise flashing across his face. "Natalie, no," she interrupted. "I can just sit here and wait for them to come back. If this is the only way to stop them, to protect this place and myself, then I'll do it." Ezra studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. You read braver than you give yourself credit for. Tell me what I need to do, she said. The rest of the day was spent preparing for the binding ritual. Ezra guided Natalie through the steps, his tone grave as he explained the process. They would need to perform the ceremony at a specific spot deep within the forest, an ancient grove that Ezra called the heart of the land. It's the source of the magic that flows through this place, he explained. But it's also dangerous. The Shadow Pack will sense what we're doing and try to stop us. Of course they will, Natalie muttered, her nerves fraying. Ezra gave her a reassuring smile. We'll be ready. The locket will help protect you and I'll handle the rest. Natalie wasn't sure how much comfort that gave her, but she nodded anyway. As the sun set once more, casting long shadows across the snow, Natalie and Ezra set out for the heart of the land. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of birds and small animals conspicuously absent. The grove, when they reached it, was breathtaking. Massive trees formed a natural cathedral, their gnarled roots twisting together in intricate patterns. The air hummed with energy, the ground beneath their feet faintly warm despite the snow. This is it, Ezra said, his voice low. Natalie stepped into the center of the grove, clutching the locket tightly. What now? Ezra moved to her side, his expression solemn. You'll stand here and recite the binding incantation. The locket will guide you, but you need to stay focused no matter what happens. Don't stop, even if a low growl cut him off, and Natalie's blood ran cold. From the shadows of the grove, crimson eyes began to appear one by one. They re-hear, Ezra said, his voice tense. He shifted his stance, his hands curling into fists as his body began to transform. Do the ritual, he shouted. I'll hold them off. Natalie's hands trembled as she opened the locket, its glow illuminating the grove. She took a deep breath and began to recite the incantation, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The wolves lunged, and the fight began anew. Natalie's voice trembled as she spoke the incantation, her eyes fixed on the locket's glow as it pulsed in her hands. The words were foreign and ancient, a language she didn't understand but felt resonate deep in her soul. The air in the grove thickened, a low hum building around her as the locket's magic began to awaken. Behind her, chaos erupted. Ezra launched himself at the first wolf that lunged, his transformation completing mid-leap. His claws raked through the beast's fur as they collided with a sickening crack, both of them crashing into the snow. The second wolf circled, its crimson eyes locked on Natalie, but Ezra was there again, intercepting it with a feral snarl. Keep going, he shouted, his voice raw and guttural. Natalie forced herself to focus, the locket trembling in her hands as its glow intensified. She repeated the incantation, her voice growing louder with each word. The grove seemed to respond, the ground beneath her feet vibrating as the ancient magic stirred. The wolves, sensing the shift, howled in unison, a chilling, discordant sound that rattled her resolve. From the shadows, more of them emerged, their forms monstrous and otherworldly. Natalie's heart raced, fear threatening to consume her. But the locket burned hot against her skin, its warmth anchoring her. She clenched it tighter, her voice steadying as she called upon the magic of the land. Ezra fought like a force of nature, his claws and teeth flashing in the dim light. He moved with a ferocity that seemed impossible, his wolf form a blur of motion as he took on the pack. But the odds were against him. The largest of the wolves stepped forward, its hulking form towering over the others. This was no ordinary Shadow Pack member, it was an alpha, its presence radiating dominance and malice. Ezra turned to face it, his chest heaving, blood streaking his fur. The alpha snarled, its crimson eyes narrowing as it advanced. Natalie risked a glance over her shoulder and felt her stomach twist. Ezra was outnumbered, and the alpha's sheer size made it clear that this fight would be unlike any other. Ezra, she cried, her voice breaking. Don't stop, he bellowed, his gaze never leaving the alpha. Finish the ritual. Tears blurred her vision as she turned back to the locket, her voice rising above the snarls and howls. The air around her shimmered with golden light, the grove coming alive as the magic surged. The Alpha lunged at Ezra, its massive claws swiping through the air. Ezra dodged, barely avoiding the blow, and countered with a vicious strike of his own. The two clashed with bone-jarring force, their growls echoing through the grove. Ezra grappled with the Alpha, his claws digging into its shoulders as he tried to hold it back. But the beast was impossibly strong, its jaws snapping dangerously close to his throat. The other wolves circled, waiting for an opening, their eyes fixed on Natalie. The Grove's magic surged again, the golden light spreading outward like ripples on a pond. The wolves recoiled, snarling, but the Alpha seemed unaffected. It threw Ezra off with a powerful swipe, sending him crashing into a tree. Natalie screamed as he fell, her heart lurching. Ezra, he groaned, struggling to push himself up. Finish it, he rasped, blood dripping from his mouth. Now the locket burned in her hands, the heat almost unbearable. Natalie's voice reached a crescendo as she spoke the final words of the incantation. By the ancient bond, let the protector rise. By blood and earth, banish the darkness. Let the balance be restored. The locket flared with blinding light, the warmth erupting outward in a wave that swept through the grove. The wolves howled in agony as the magic struck them, their forms convulsing and shifting. The golden light consumed them, tearing through their connection to the land. One by one, they disintegrated into ash, their howls fading into the night. The Alpha roared in defiance, its massive body writhing against the magic. It turned toward Natalie, its crimson eyes blazing with hatred. She stood her ground, the locket still glowing in her hands. "You redone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The Alpha lunged, its claws outstretched, and Ezra was there. With a final, desperate roar, he tackled the Alpha, driving it back into the light. The magic surged around them, and the Alpha let out a piercing howl as its body disintegrated, its form dissolving into nothingness. Ezra collapsed to the ground, his body shifting back to human as the golden light faded. The grove fell silent. Natalie dropped to her knees, the locket slipping from her hands as exhaustion overtook her. Her chest heaved, her limbs trembling from the effort of the ritual. "Ezra," she whispered, crawling toward him. He lay motionless in the snow, his face pale and bloodied. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was too late. But then he stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Natalie," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for him, her hands trembling. "You okay?" she whispered, relief flooding her. "You okay?" He gave her a faint smile, his hand brushing hers. "We did it," he said, his voice weak but full of pride. She nodded, her chest tightening. "Yeah," she said softly. "We did." As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the grove seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight of the Shadow Pack's presence finally lifted. The forest was quiet once more, but Natalie knew the battle had changed her forever. The land had claimed her, and she had claimed it in return. Together, they would face whatever came next. Natalie stayed by Ezra's side until the warmth of dawn spread through the grove. The sunlight filtering through the ancient trees felt different now, gentler, more alive. She could sense it, faint but unmistakable, the pulse of the land itself, thrumming like a heartbeat, steady and strong. The bond had been forged. Ezra stirred, his face etched with exhaustion and pain, but no longer bearing the strain of constant tension. His eyes opened slowly, their familiar gray hue meeting hers. "How are you feeling?" Natalie asked, her voice soft. "Like I got hit by a train," he muttered with a weak smile, "but ILL live." She laughed, the sound shaky and relieved. "Good, because I don't think I could handle any more surprises right now." Ezra reached for her hand, his grip light but firm. "You saved the forest, Natalie. You saved all of us." Her chest tightened at his words. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her gaze dropping to the locket, which now lay quiet and still in the snow beside her. Its once brilliant glow had dimmed to a faint shimmer, as if it too was resting. Ezra followed her gaze and nodded. "The locket's power is tied to you now." It'll respond when you need it, but it's more than just a weapon. It's a connection to the land, to the magic. Treat it with care. She picked up the locket, feeling its cool weight in her hand. Does this mean they really gone? She asked, a hint of doubt creeping into her voice. Ezra sat up slowly, wincing as he did. The ones we fought are gone, yes, but the shadow pack isn't finished. They'll regroup, maybe even come back someday, but they'll think twice now. They know this land has a protector again. Natalie looked around the grove, the towering trees and vibrant energy that filled the space. It no longer felt like a mere patch of forest, it felt alive, sacred, and hers in a way she couldn't fully explain. They returned to the farmhouse as the sun climbed higher, bathing the snow-covered landscape in golden light. Ezra leaned on her for support, his injuries healing but still slowing him down. Inside, Natalie helped him to the couch and fetched water and fresh bandages. As she worked, the quiet between them was companionable, the tension of the previous night replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment. "You're stronger than you think," Ezra said after a while, his tone contemplative. Natalie paused, her hands hovering over a bandage. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "I feel overwhelmed. Like I don't even know who I am anymore." Ezra tilted his head, studying her. "You're someone who stood up when it mattered, someone who fought for something bigger than yourself. That's who you are." She met his gaze, searching for any trace of doubt. There was none. "And what about you?" she asked. "What happens now?" Ezra leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I keep doing what I've always done, protecting this place. But now I am not alone anymore." His words settled over her like a warm blanket, soothing her frayed nerves. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. Over the next few days, the forest seemed to come alive in ways Natalie hadn't noticed before. Birds returned to the trees, their songs filling the air. The oppressive weight that had lingered over the land was gone, replaced by a quiet harmony that she could feel in her very bones. She spent her mornings walking through the woods, learning to trust her newfound connection to the land. The locket remained a constant presence, its faint hum reminding her of the bond she had forged. Ezra often joined her, his strength returning with each passing day. They talked about the land, about her grandmother, and about the battles they might still face. But they also laughed, sharing lighter moments that felt like rays of sunlight piercing through a dense canopy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Natalie turned to Ezra. "Do you think my grandmother knew this would happen?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Ezra nodded. "She always saw farther ahead than anyone else. She believed in you even before you believed in yourself." Natalie smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I wish she were here. I wish I could talk to her." "She is here," Ezra said, his voice soft. "In the land and the magic in you." Everything she stood for lives on. Natalie let his words sink in, a sense of peace washing over her. She wasn't the same person who had arrived at the farmhouse weeks ago, seeking solace from the chaos of city life. She was something more now, stronger, braver, and deeply connected to a world she had once barely understood. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting the forest in shades of gold and amber, Natalie reached for the locket and held it close. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The forest was her home now, and she would protect it with everything she had. The days stretched into weeks, and life at the farmhouse settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and deeply natural. Natalie found herself adapting to the quiet strength of the land and the steady presence of Ezra. The city she'd once called home seemed like a distant memory, its chaos and noise replaced by the soothing hum of the forest. But even in the calm, she couldn't forget what had happened or what could still come. The shadow pack wasn't defeated, only driven back, and the knowledge of their potential return loomed like a shadow on the edge of her thoughts. One crisp morning, as frost glittered on the fields and the air smelled of pine and snow, Natalie stood in the clearing where she had performed the binding ritual. The grove felt different now, brighter, as though the land itself had breathed a sigh of relief. She could feel the connection humming in her chest, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. Ezra approached from the edge of the trees, his movements quieter than she would have expected for someone so solid. He carried a bundle of wood on his shoulder, his coat dusted with snow. "You out here early," he said, setting the wood down near the base of a tree. Natalie shrugged, her breath visible in the cold air. "I needed to think. It's overwhelming sometimes." Ezra nodded, his expression understanding. "The bond is strong. You're feeling the land's energy more than ever now. It's a lot to take in." She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Understatement of the year. He chuckled, but his gaze turned serious. "It'll get easier. You're readjusting faster than I expected, faster than most would." "Do you think the shadow pack will come back?" she asked, voicing the question that had been circling in her mind since the night of the ritual. Ezra's jaw tightened. Eventually, he admitted, "They'll wait, regroup, and when they think they've found a weakness, they'll strike. But they'll be more cautious now. What you did scared them." Natalie exhaled slowly, her hands tightening around the locket resting against her chest. "I just wish we could stop them for good." "We will," Ezra said, his voice resolute. "The land is stronger now, and so are we. They've lost their advantage. That means we have time to prepare to learn." She looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. His gaze softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "I told you before, you're not alone in this. Neither am I. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Natalie felt a warmth spread through her chest, her resolve strengthening. "Together," she echoed. In the weeks that followed, Ezra began teaching her more about the land and the magic that flowed through it. They explored the forest, uncovering hidden glades and ancient markers that told the story of the land's guardianship. Natalie learned to sense shifts in the energy around her, to listen for the subtle warnings the forest provided. Ezra also began training her to defend herself, insisting that she needed to be ready for anything. At first, the physical demands were grueling, but Natalie pushed herself, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You're a quick learner," Ezra said one afternoon after a particularly intense session. Natalie wiped sweat from her brow, grinning despite her exhaustion. "Or you're a good teacher." He smirked, but there was pride in his eyes. "Maybe both." One evening, as they sat by the fire in the farmhouse, Natalie opened her grandmother's journal again. She flipped through the pages, stopping at an entry that caught her attention. "Listen to this," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "The land remembers. It holds the echoes of those who have walked it before, their strength woven into its fabric. A protector need only listen to hear their guidance." Ezra leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Your grandmother understood the land better than anyone. She knew its secrets." Natalie looked up at him. "Do you think I could talk to her? Through the land?" Ezra's expression softened. "It's possible. The bond you share with the forest is deep. If anyone could reach her, it's you." The thought filled Natalie with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had so many questions, so much she wanted to say. "Will you help me?" she asked. Ezra nodded. "Always." The next morning, they returned to the grove where the ritual had taken place. Natalie stood in the center, the locket clutched in her hands while Ezra stood nearby, a steadying presence. "Close your eyes," he instructed. "Feel the land beneath you. Let its energy guide you." She did as he said, her breathing slowing as she focused on the hum of the grove. The connection felt stronger here, almost overwhelming, as though the forest itself were alive around her. The locket grew warm in her hands, and she felt a surge of energy rise through her. A faint whisper reached her ears, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, and she opened her mind to it. "Natalie," came a voice, soft and familiar. Her breath caught, tears springing to her eyes. "Grandma," the voice grew stronger, filled with warmth and love. "You've done so much, my dear, more than I ever could have imagined. I am so proud of you." Natalie's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can do this. I am scared." "You're stronger than you know," her grandmother's voice said gently. "The land chose you for a reason. Trust in it and in yourself." The warmth of the connection filled Natalie with a sense of peace and purpose. When the voice faded, she opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Ezra stepped forward, his expression tender. Did you hear her? Natalie nodded, her heart full. She said she was proud of me. Ezra smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. She's right. For the first time in weeks, Natalie felt a deep, unshakable calm. She wasn't just a visitor here anymore, she was the protector of this land, and she was ready for whatever came next. As winter began to loosen its grip, the forest seemed to exhale with relief. Snow melted into trickling streams, and new life emerged in the form of tiny buds on trees and the return of birdsong in the mornings. The land felt vibrant and alive, a reflection of the balance Natalie had worked so hard to help restore. But she knew the peace was temporary. One morning, Natalie stood on the farmhouse porch, her eyes scanning the tree line as the sun rose. The locket rested against her chest, its faint hum a constant presence now. She had grown used to its weight, its warmth, and the quiet reassurance it offered. Ezra joined her, his steps quiet on the wooden planks. He looked healthier now, his movements no longer weighed down by the injuries he sustained during the battle with the Shadow Pack. "Good morning," he said, leaning against the railing. "Morning," she replied, her gaze never leaving the forest. "You worried," Ezra observed. Natalie sighed, her breath visible in the crisp air. "I keep expecting them to come back. Every time I hear a noise out there, I think it's them." Ezra's expression darkened slightly. It's natural to feel that way. The Shadow Pack isn't finished with us, not by a long shot. But they were not invincible, Natalie. We proved that. She nodded but couldn't shake the tension that had settled in her chest. "I just wish we had some kind of warning, something to tell us when they were coming." Ezra was quiet for a moment, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "There might be a way," he said. Natalie turned to him. "What do you mean?" "The land has its own way of communicating," he explained. "It's subtle, but if you know how to listen, it can warn you of danger. Your grandmother understood that. It's how she kept this place safe for so long." Natalie tilted her head, intrigued. "How do I learn to listen?" Ezra smiled faintly. "Patience, for one. The land doesn't speak in words, it speaks in signs, in feelings. You've already started to feel it, haven't you? That sense of something being off." She nodded slowly. "I have, like a pressure in the air or a change in the way the forest sounds. That's it," he said. "The bond you have with the land makes you more attuned to those changes. Over time, you'll learn to interpret them." Natalie frowned, a spark of determination lighting in her chest. "Then teach me." Ezra met her gaze, his expression serious. "It won't be easy," he warned, "and it won't happen overnight." "I don't care," she said firmly. "If it helps us stay ahead of them, I'll do whatever it takes." Ezra smiled, his pride in her evident. "All right. Let us start today." The lessons were unlike anything Natalie had ever experienced. Ezra guided her through the forest, showing her how to pay attention to the smallest details, the direction of the wind, the way the birds called to each other, the texture of the earth beneath her feet. At first, it was overwhelming. The forest was alive with so many sounds and movements that it was difficult to distinguish what mattered from what didn't. But over time, she began to notice patterns, the way the trees swayed differently when the air carried a warning, the sudden silence of animals before a disturbance. "It's not about looking for answers," Ezra explained one afternoon as they crouched near a stream. "It's about being present. The land won't always tell you what's coming, but it'll always give you the tools to prepare." Natalie nodded, her focus sharpening. "Like instinct?" "Exactly," Ezra said. "It's not something you can force, you just have to trust it." As spring began to bloom in earnest, Natalie felt her connection to the land deepen. She could sense its rhythms now, its quiet strength. The fear that had once consumed her was still there, but it was tempered by a growing confidence in her role as the land's protector. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the farmhouse, Ezra leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "You've come a long way," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Natalie looked up from the locket, which she had been absently turning over in her hands. "I had a good teacher," she said with a small smile. Ezra smirked, but there was a warmth in his eyes. "You didn't need much teaching. The strength was always there, you just had to find it. Her smile faltered slightly as she thought of the shadow pack, of the battles that might still lie ahead. "Do you think it'll ever really be over?" she asked softly. Ezra's expression grew serious. "I didn't he know," he admitted. "The shadow pack's hunger for power won't just disappear, but I do know that they weaker now, and as long as you here, they'll think twice before trying anything." Natalie nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. "Then we'll be ready," she said. Ezra reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "We will," he said. The fire crackled between them, its warmth a quiet reminder of the battles they had already won and the ones they were ready to face together. The farmhouse, once a place of solitude and memories, had become something more, a sanctuary, a fortress, and a symbol of their shared resolve. The forest outside hummed with life, its energy vibrant and strong. Natalie felt it in her bones, a steady rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just protecting the land was protecting her too. The days turned into weeks, and the forest began to bloom with the fullness of spring. The once barren trees were now vibrant with fresh leaves, their emerald canopies casting dappled sunlight on the forest floor. Natalie had never felt more connected to a place or a purpose. Her mornings were spent walking the land, her senses attuned to its rhythms. She would pause often, closing her eyes and letting the forest speak to her in its quiet, unspoken language. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind carried meaning. Ezra was always nearby, a steadfast presence. He continued to teach her about the forest's history, the old magic that tied them both to this place. Their bond deepened with each passing day, a partnership forged in trust and tested by fire. One morning, as Natalie explored a sunlit glade near the farmhouse, she felt a subtle shift in the air. The wind stilled, the birds grew quiet, and a faint pressure settled over her chest, a sensation she had come to recognize as a warning. "Something's not right," she murmured to herself, her hand instinctively reaching for the locket resting against her chest. Ezra appeared moments later, his sharp eyes scanning the glade. "You feel it too," he said, his tone low. Natalie nodded. "What is it?" He crouched, pressing his hand to the earth. His brow furrowed and he closed his eyes as if listening. After a moment he stood, his jaw tight. "They retesting us," he said grimly. Her stomach twisted. "The shadow pack," Ezra nodded. "It's subtle, but they nearby. They probing the edges of the land, looking for weaknesses." Natalie clenched her fists, anger flaring in her chest. "They don't give up, do they?" "They won't," Ezra said. "Not until they've taken what they want. But they won't catch us off guard this time." Back at the farmhouse, they prepared for the possibility of another attack. Ezra showed Natalie how to fortify the house using iron nails and salt, old protections against dark magic, and the wolves' influence. They created safe zones around the property, using the land's natural energy to strengthen their defenses. As they worked, Natalie couldn't ignore the tension building in the air. The forest felt watchful, its usual calm replaced by a sense of anticipation. "They waiting for something," she said one evening as they stood on the porch, watching the tree line. Ezra nodded. "They waiting for us to slip up. But we won tea." The next few days passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease lingered. Natalie and Ezra took turns patrolling the forest, watching for signs of the pack. Each night, she slept with the locket close, its faint hum a source of comfort. Then, on the third night, the attack came. Natalie was jolted awake by a sound outside, a low, guttural growl that sent her heart racing. She bolted upright, her hand flying to the locket as she strained to listen. The growl was followed by a sharp, bone-chilling howl, and then the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. "They here," she whispered. Ezra was already at the door, his body tense, his eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "I'll draw them away." "No," Natalie said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am not letting you face them alone." Ezra hesitated, his gaze softening. Natalie, I am ready, she interrupted, her grip tightening around the locket. We've trained for this. He nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in her eyes. Then stay close, he said. They stepped outside into the cold night, the forest bathed in silver moonlight. Shadows flickered at the edges of the clearing, and crimson eyes glowed in the darkness. The shadow pack was here. The fight was brutal and chaotic. The wolves emerged from the shadows in a flurry of snarls and snapping jaws, their movements impossibly fast. Ezra shifted immediately, his wolf form colliding with the first attacker in a blur of claws and fur. Natalie stood her ground in the protective circle they had created, the locket glowing brightly in her hands. She focused on the energy of the land, calling on its strength as she had practiced. The golden light from the locket spread outward, creating a barrier that the wolves couldn't cross. But the pack was relentless. They circled the barrier, testing its strength, their howls piercing the night. Natalie's arms trembled as she poured her energy into maintaining the magic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ezra fought like a force of nature, his claws raking through fur and flesh as he held the wolves at bay. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once. One of the wolves broke through, lunging toward Natalie with a snarl. She reacted instinctively, raising the locket and shouting the words of the binding spell. The wolf froze mid-leap, its body writhing as the golden light enveloped it. With a final howl, it disintegrated into ash. Natalie's chest heaved, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Good, Ezra shouted, his voice rough and raw. Keep going. The battle raged on, the pack throwing everything they had at the farmhouse. But Natalie and Ezra held their ground, their bond with the land stronger than ever. As dawn broke, the remaining wolves retreated, their howls fading into the distance. Natalie collapsed to her knees, the locket dimming in her hands as the last of its magic faded. Ezra staggered to her side, his body bloodied but unbowed. You did it, he said, his voice filled with pride. We did it, she corrected, her voice trembling with exhaustion and relief. The forest fell quiet once more, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the snow. Though they had won the night, Natalie knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew they were stronger together, and as long as the land stood with them, they would never fight alone. The aftermath of the battle left the farmhouse in a fragile, haunting stillness. The golden hues of dawn painted the snow-covered ground in soft light, but Natalie couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. The fight had been brutal, testing every ounce of her strength, resolve, and the bond she now shared with the land. Ezra sat on the porch steps, blood streaking his torn clothes. His wolf form had receded, leaving behind a weary man with a haunted gaze. Natalie joined him, her knees weak as she lowered herself beside him. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. You re-hurt, she said softly, her eyes scanning the fresh cuts and bruises that marred his arms and face. I'll heal, he replied, his voice rough but steady. The land takes care of its own. Natalie nodded, her fingers brushing against the locket at her chest. Its once vibrant hum had dimmed to a faint pulse, as though it too was recovering from the battle. Do you think they'll come back? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra tilted his head, his sharp gray eyes meeting hers. Eventually, he admitted, but they'll be cautious now. They know we're not easy prey. The words should have brought her comfort, but they didn't. The Shadow Pack's relentless hunger for power felt like an ever-present storm on the horizon, its clouds gathering even as the sun rose. What happens if we can stop them next time? Natalie asked, her voice trembling. Ezra reached out, his hand brushing hers. Then we'll fight harder, he said. Because that's what we do, Natalie. We protect this land. We protect each other. Her chest tightened, a flicker of warmth cutting through her fear. I don't know if I'll ever be as strong as you, she admitted. Ezra smiled faintly. You're stronger than you think, he said. You've already proven that. The hours that followed were a blur of tending to the farmhouse and the land. Natalie and Ezra reinforced their protective wards, ensuring the boundaries of the property were secure. The scars of the battle were everywhere: claw marks on trees, patches of disturbed earth where the wolves had fallen, but the land felt steadier now, its balance slowly returning. As they worked, Natalie found herself glancing at Ezra more often than she cared to admit. There was a quiet resilience about him, a strength that went beyond his supernatural abilities. He bore the weight of his role with a steady determination that inspired her, even when her own doubts crept in. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, Natalie sat by the fire, her grandmother's journal open in her lap. The pages were filled with wisdom and notes about the forest, the magic, and the bond she now carried. Ezra joined her, his movements quieter than usual. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his sharp features softened by the firelight. "Anything new?" he asked, nodding toward the journal. Natalie traced a passage with her finger, her brow furrowing. "There's something here about the Shadow Pack's origins," she said. "It talks about how their corruption started with a betrayal. The wolves fell when they turned away from the balance, seeking power beyond the land's will." Ezra's expression darkened. "That sounds about right. The pack was once part of the Guardians long before my time. They broke away, driven by greed and a hunger for dominance. That greed twisted them into what they are now." Natalie looked up at him, a question lingering on her lips. "Do you think there's any way to undo it, to bring them back to what they were?" Ezra hesitated, his gaze dropping to the fire. "I've wondered that myself," he admitted. "But if there is a way, I don't know it. The corruption runs deep. It's become who they are." Her chest tightened at the weight of his words. "So we just keep fighting them." "For now," he said. "But that doesn't mean we stop looking for answers." That night, as the farmhouse settled into an uneasy calm, Natalie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the battle, the locket's magic, Ezra's quiet strength. She turned her head toward the window, the moonlight casting faint shadows on the walls. The forest beyond seemed almost peaceful, its dangers temporarily at bay, but she knew better than to let her guard down. The shadow pack was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for their chance. And though the bond she shared with the land was strong, she couldn't shake the feeling that more challenges lay ahead, challenges that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her into sleep, one thought lingered in her mind. She wasn't alone. The land, Ezra, and the memory of her grandmother stood with her. And no matter what came next, she would face it head-on. The next morning, sunlight poured into the farmhouse, dappling the wooden floors with golden light. Natalie woke with a start, the remnants of uneasy dreams still clinging to her. She stretched, wincing slightly as the soreness from the previous night's battle reminded her of just how much her body had endured. Downstairs, she found Ezra already awake, standing near the kitchen window. He held a steaming cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the forest outside. "You re-up early," she said, her voice still raspy from sleep. Ezra glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "The forest's been quiet, too quiet." Natalie poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him at the window. The tree line looked tranquil, the sunlight filtering through the leaves casting long shadows across the snow-dappled ground. But she understood what he meant. The stillness carried a weight, a sense of anticipation that made her uneasy. "Do you think they regrouping?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "Probably," Ezra replied, his voice low, "but something feels different." "Different how?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know yet. The land is shifting. It's subtle, but it's there." Natalie frowned, her grip tightening on her mug. "Do you think it's them? The shadow pack?" "Maybe," Ezra said. "Or it could be something else entirely." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had only just begun to grasp the intricacies of the land's magic and its dangers, and the idea of a new threat emerging was almost too much to bear. The rest of the morning was spent reinforcing their defenses and patrolling the edges of the property. Natalie felt a growing sense of unease as she walked the familiar paths. her senses hyper-attuned to every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. At one point, she paused near a small brook, the water sparkling in the sunlight. The locket hummed faintly against her chest, a gentle reminder of the power she now carried. She closed her eyes, focusing on the land's energy, trying to sense what Ezra had described. At first, there was nothing but the quiet hum of life, the rustling of leaves, the trickle of water, the distant call of a bird. But then she felt it, a faint, pulsing rhythm, deeper and more erratic than the land's usual calm. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Natalie opened her eyes, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Ezra asked, appearing at her side. "I didn't know," she said, her voice shaky, "but something's wrong. The forest feels off." Ezra frowned, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. "We should head back," he said. "Whatever it is, we need to be ready." As they returned to the farmhouse, the sky began to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that cut through Natalie's coat. Inside, they worked quickly, gathering supplies and preparing for whatever might come. Ezra sharpened the iron blade he always carried, his movements precise and methodical. Natalie focused on the locket, her fingers tracing its intricate patterns as she tried to steady her nerves. By nightfall, the storm had arrived, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees. The farmhouse felt smaller, its walls barely holding back the chaos outside. "We're not alone," Ezra said suddenly, his voice tense. Natalie froze, her eyes snapping to his. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly as if catching a scent. "They here," he said, "but it's not the shadow pack." Her blood ran cold. "Then who is it?" Before Ezra could answer, a loud knock echoed through the farmhouse, the sound sharp and deliberate. Natalie's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Ezra, whose expression had hardened into a mask of caution. "Stay behind me," he said, moving toward the door. Ezra opened the door cautiously, the iron blade hidden behind his back. Standing on the porch was a man, a stranger drenched from the rain. His dark hair clung to his face, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue, glittered with an intensity that made Natalie's stomach twist. "Sorry to disturb you," the man said, his voice smooth and calm. "I seem to have lost my way." Ezra didn't move, his posture rigid. "This isn't a good place to wander," he said, his tone clipped. "You should move along." The man smiled faintly, his gaze flicking past Ezra to where Natalie stood in the doorway. "I think I am exactly where I need to be," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. Natalie's breath hitched, an inexplicable chill running through her. There was something deeply unsettling about the man, something that set her instincts on edge. "Who are you?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a traveler," he said, looking for a bit of shelter from the storm. Ezra stepped forward, his body blocking Natalie from the stranger's view. "This isn't a place for travelers," he said firmly. "Keep moving." The man's expression darkened slightly, the faintest hint of irritation flickering across his face. "That's a shame," he said, his voice still smooth but now carrying an edge. "I was hoping to speak with the land's new protector." Natalie's heart sank, her blood running cold. "How do you know about that?" she demanded. The man's gaze flicked to her again, his smile returning. "Let us just say the forest has eyes," he said, "and it's not just the shadow pack you should be worried about." Ezra's grip on the blade tightened. "You need to leave. Now." The man tilted his head as if considering the command. Then he stepped back, his smile never wavering. "Very well," he said, "but we'll meet again, Natalie, sooner than you think." Before either of them could respond, he turned and walked into the storm, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. As the door slammed shut, Natalie turned to Ezra, her hands trembling. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra's expression was grim, his jaw tight. "I didn't know," he admitted, "but he wasn't human." Natalie shivered, clutching the locket tightly. Whatever that man was, she knew one thing for certain: the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence in the farmhouse was deafening after the stranger disappeared into the storm. Natalie and Ezra stood frozen near the door, the tension between them thick with unspoken fear. The rain continued to lash against the windows, but it was the memory of the man's voice, smooth, knowing, and entirely too calm, that sent shivers down Natalie's spine. "He knew my name," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And he knew about the locket." Ezra turned to her, his expression dark and unreadable. "That's what worries me the most. Whoever or whatever he's not just some wanderer. He came here for a reason." Natalie clutched the locket, its cool weight grounding her. "What do we do?" Ezra moved to the window, his sharp eyes scanning the forest. "First, we figure out if he left anything behind, traps, signs, or worse. Someone like that doesn't he just appear without a purpose?" His words sent a chill through her, but she nodded. "I'll help." "You staying inside," Ezra said firmly, turning to face her. "No," Natalie shot back, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. "This is my fight too. If there's something out there, I need to see it." Ezra's jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers. After a moment he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Fine," he said reluctantly, "but you stay close to me. Don't wander, and if I tell you to run, you run." "Got it." "Got it," she said, her grip on the locket tightening. The storm had softened by the time they ventured outside, though the rain still fell in a steady drizzle, soaking the ground beneath their feet. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, uneasy energy that made the hairs on the back of Natalie's neck stand on end. Ezra led the way, his movements silent and purposeful. Natalie followed close behind, her eyes darting to every shadow and flicker of movement in the underbrush. "Anything?" she asked after a few tense minutes. "Not yet," Ezra murmured, his voice low. "But keep your eyes open. He left too easily. There's something we're not seeing." As they moved deeper into the forest, Natalie felt the familiar hum of the land beneath her feet, its energy shifting and pulsing like a warning. She stopped abruptly, her gaze snapping to a spot just ahead. "Wait," she said, her voice tight. Ezra halted, following her gaze. The ground in front of them seemed wrong. The soil was darker, almost black, and the plants nearby had withered as though drained of life. "What is that?" Natalie asked, her stomach churning. Ezra knelt, his hand hovering over the corrupted ground but not touching it. "It's tainted," he said grimly. "Dark magic. He left his mark." Natalie's pulse quickened. "Why? What does it mean?" Ezra straightened, his expression hard. "It's a message. He's claiming this place or trying to. The magic here is strong, and if he can corrupt it, he'll weaken the land's defenses." She clenched her fists, anger flaring in her chest. "Can we stop it?" "We can cleanse it," Ezra said, "but it won't be easy. This kind of magic lingers, and it takes time to push it out." Natalie stepped closer, the locket humming against her chest. "Will this help?" Ezra glanced at the locket, then nodded. "Yes, the locket is tied to the land's pure magic. It can undo the corruption, but it'll take a lot out of you." "I don't care," Natalie said. "Tell me what to do." Ezra guided her through the process, explaining how to channel the locket's energy into the ground. Natalie knelt at the edge of the corrupted soil, the locket glowing faintly in her hands. "Focus on the land," Ezra said, his voice calm and steady. "Feel its rhythm. Let the locket connect you to it." Natalie closed her eyes, her breathing slowing as she concentrated. The hum of the locket grew stronger, its warmth spreading through her chest and into her arms. She pressed her hands to the ground, the corrupted soil cold and unyielding beneath her fingers. "By the bond of the land," she whispered, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word, "I call upon its purity. Let this darkness be banished. Let the balance be restored." The locket flared with golden light, the energy surging through her and into the earth. The corrupted soil resisted at first, the dark magic pushing back like a tide. But Natalie held firm, pouring everything she had into the connection. The darkness began to recede, the blackened soil fading into rich brown, and the withered plants slowly unfurled, their leaves regaining their vibrant green. Finally, the glow of the locket dimmed, and Natalie slumped forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You did it," Ezra said, his hand steadying her. "It's gone." Natalie nodded weakly, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Do you think he'll try again?" Ezra's expression darkened. "Probably. But now he knows what he's up against." Back at the farmhouse, Natalie collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Ezra handed her a mug of tea, his sharp features softening as he sat beside her. "That was reckless," he said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice. "It worked," Natalie replied, her lips quirking into a faint smile. Ezra chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You re-stubborn, you know that? I've been told," she said, leaning back and letting the warmth of the tea seep into her hands. The storm outside had passed, but the unease lingered. Whoever the stranger was, he had made his presence known and his intentions were clear. Natalie glanced at Ezra, her resolve hardening. "We'll stop him," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Ezra met her gaze, his gray eyes filled with quiet determination. "Yes," he said, "we will." As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Natalie felt the weight of her roles settle over her once more. The land needed her, and she wouldn't let it down. No matter what came next, she was ready to fight.